Hello.
Hello, John. How are you doing?
What can I do for you?
Well, today's episode's all about tool use, you see. So I was wondering, just for the show, whether you could show us your favourite tool.
What? Get out of it. No, certainly not.
Hello everyone, yes, it is the 11th instalment now of the Acquisition of Behaviour series. Now you might be wondering, what the hell am I doing? Well, today's episode's all about tool use, so I thought, why not, just to keep this series exciting, do this outside my garden shed. This is my garden shed, and obviously my garden shed has loads of tools in it, so it just seemed perfect. So tools then, they can become sort of the extended phenotype of a lot of animals, right? And this is something which Richard Dawkins has been talking about a lot. But what is the definition of a tool in the animal kingdom? Let's start with a good definition. So here it is. It's use of an external object as a functional extension of the body to attain an immediate goal. That's what we mean by tool use. And for a long time, we didn't really think animals could use tools at all. In fact, pretty much all examples of tool use in animals have been discovered within the past 30 years. What examples are there? Well, digger wasps are parasitic wasps which drag dead insect bodies underground into their burrows, and they use stones at the top of their burrows to flatten out the surface of the sand. So it's less likely for a competing digger wasp to find their dead body. Right? Fantastic. Octopodes, by the way, that is the correct plural for an octopus, by the way. It's an octopode. Some of them can use coconut shells as a sort of, well, like a shell, to protect themselves from any predators. Archerfish, this may not strictly be a tool, but they can spit water out of their mouths to catch prey on overhanging leaves. Amazing stuff. Chimpanzees, probably one of the most famous, can use probes to fish for termites, but it's not chimpanzees that can do this, as we're going to see. Woodpecker finches and New Caledonian Crows can do this as well. Egyptian vultures can use stones to open ostrich shells, and also sea otters can use stones to hammer away at the hard exoskeleton of crustaceans, right? Capuchin monkeys, is probably my favourite, can smash stuff like a good nut or something by not just hitting it, but also jumping into the air and smashing it down, just to give it that extra force. I'll try to demonstrate it, but it's a bit like that. Now this idea that animals use tools raises questions on animal intelligence, so proper lab experiments need to be done. Now we've all heard that famous Aesop's fable of the clever crow dropping stones in the glass of water to raise the water level so it can get a lovely drink, right? God, you haven't had a childhood if you haven't. But this turns out to have some fact to it, because experiments have been done on rooks by appropriately named Bird and Mr. Emery. Okay, and these are controlled experiments. And they showed that the rooks were able to work out if a waxworm was placed on the meniscus of a measuring cylinder, which was filled with water, but it wasn't quite filled enough for the rook to reach it. It would drop the stones into the water and raise the water level. Ingenious. And this was highly successful whatever the water level. But you've got to think in more simpleton terms. It's quite likely that the rook has some sort of a sense on how long its beak is, right? So it's unlikely that it's conducting some sort of calculation, right? Because what was interesting was that the rooks were using exactly the right amount of stones each time. So obviously unlikely to be doing some really complex maths and, the rook doesn't really know Newton's laws of physics. I think we can accept that. But in the second experiment, the rooks were given big and small stones, right? And the birds quickly learn once again to use the big stones rather than the small stones. So therefore, Bird and Emery concluded that the rooks have a great appreciation of task affordances. What's task affordances? Right, well I've got the definition here. Affordance is a relationship between an object or an environment and an organism that, through a collection of stimuli, affords the opportunity for that organism to perform an action. Now that sounds complicated, but it's really quite simple. So for example, a knob, a doorknob, affords to twist or to push, a lever affords to pull, and so on. Okay? Now, this is unlikely to be a conditioned action. Rather, it is goal-directed behaviour with delayed gratification. Obviously, the gratification being a nice, tasty drink at the end of the crow's lovely hard work. The problem with these sorts of experiments on tool use is that the sample sizes are usually pretty small. So that raises questions on whether the results are actually that reliable, right? Now, a classic experiment which is done is called the trap tube task. And I've done another brilliant diagram here on the board, and I think it's actually, well, it's quite a simple concept anyway, but let's go on with it. So we have a tube, right? And in the middle of the tube, we have this little tasty peanut. You see the tasty peanut? Now, if a chimp or whatever animal you're testing pokes with a twig from this direction, right, from the right, then it'll push the peanut out this end and it'll have it for its tea, right? Delicious. If he pushes it from the other end, then you'll push the peanut into this trap here, never to be retrieved again. Okay? And surprisingly, a lot of animals can work out this task. Chimps can do it, capuchins can do it, Darwin's finches can do it, corvids can do it. Now, this kind of intelligence may be a result of convergent evolution, and the mechanisms behind it may be genetically pre-programmed. Now, a guy called Tebic studied the tool use behaviour of woodpecker finches on the Santa Cruz island of the Galapagos archipelago, right? And they were testing their ability to use twigs to fish out little invertebrates in logs, because obviously logs are a great food resource. There's loads of crevices in there where tasty meals could be hiding, right? So what he found was that in dry areas you get tool use, and in humid areas you don't. To test the effects of social learning, birds from humid areas were kept in cages with twigs for 14 days. And of course they were provided with artificial logs with treats inside them. Now, believe it or not, only 13 out of 28 of them actually developed the art of using the twigs to get the food. Now, in 10 of the non-tool users, they were given exposure to the logs and the twigs for another 14 days. But then, only one of them developed the tool use. Now, there's one important point that would happen in this experiment. This experiment was using adult birds. Now remember, in our experiment with the rats last time, if we use young animals, then our results changed completely. So in a second experiment, when young birds either interacted with tool users or non-tool users, what was found then is that all the birds in both groups eventually learned to use the twigs to get at the food, the beetle larvae within the logs, right? So there could be a critical stage in the bird's life in which it has to learn this behaviour. So to conclude, there might be a genetic predisposition for species-typical early behaviours which eventually develop into tool use. Now this has been selected through natural selection, but as we've seen, that individual learning and practice is extremely important, okay? But we've also shown that social learning is not essential because it didn't matter if a tool user or a non-tool user was actually there. I knew the outdoors would get the better of me eventually. But anyway, yes, our next example is done by Kenwood on New Caledonian Crows. And it's going on sort of the same sort of idea about using twigs as tools to get stuff out of logs. Right. Okay, so individuals were hand-reared, and half of the individuals were given exposure to a twig tool, which was demonstrated by the humans. Okay, the human parents, if you like. And the other group didn't have any exposure to a tool at all. They didn't even know what it was, okay? Now this was to tease apart inherited, individually learnt and social factors in this behaviour. And what the results were is that both groups showed clear sort of stereotypical object manipulation at similar ages, regardless on whether they'd been exposed to demonstrations from the tool or not. So therefore it's thought that this tool use behaviour is an evolved specialisation in this species, but species typical action patterns allow it to help develop this behaviour. So although it's partly inherited, what was found was that individuals which had demonstrations of the tool did use tools more, and they used specific tools which they'd seen their demonstrators use. Okay? So, although genetics does seem to be playing a role, individual learning, social learning and cultural transmission are all playing a part in this as well. Now, it's always been a great interest to humans to see whether our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, can do any problem solving. Okay, it's been done for a long time. But it's thought that this usually involves a lot of trial and error learning, so the results really aren't that impressive. What's even more interesting is whether chimpanzees can actually undergo thought experiments. But here, the argument by ethologists is that usually the experiment is a bit of a circus act because everything is set up in exactly the perfect way for that chimp to rapidly learn that specific behaviour that you're testing. So it's always good sort of go back to reality and think that simple processes could be underlying these apparently complex cognitive feats. This is something we covered in the very first video of this series, Morgan's Canon. God, those were the days, eh? And ecology is likely to play a big role in whether that a behaviour develops or not as well. And that isn't usually made realistic in lab experiments, right? Now, what's always good to bring down reality is to think about invertebrates, right? There's a creature called the antlion, which lives in Guernsey, right, which hides under the sand, and it has a little tunnel, right? And what it does, it flicks sand at passers-by, well, prey items like ants, and it drags them down into its tunnel, so it's sort of using the sand as a tool. Now, we probably wouldn't think for a second that the antlion has any insight into the problem whatsoever. It's just genetically pre-programmed to flick the sand at the ant, right? And this can be applied to a lot of behaviour in social insects, and what's normally more useful to apply is this idea of algorithms. Okay? Now, what's the definition of an algorithm? An algorithm is a process or set of rules to be followed in problem-solving operations, especially by a computer. Well, not especially by a computer, because this is what basically controls most of social insect behaviour. It's all genetically programmed algorithms. That's what controls everything. It's also easy while we're looking, for the most interesting examples of tool use which no one has seen before. We can often forget some of the most obvious examples of tool use. Bird nests, for example, are incredible feats of architecture. Yeah? Absolutely fantastic. So we can therefore consider without a doubt that nest building is a form of tool use. Okay, hope you enjoyed that. I'll be back next time. I'm going to change it up next time. We're going to be asking some more deep questions of whether animals can do even more complex behaviour. We're going to be asking whether animals can count. Right, see you then.